Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet evening where we shall drift together through shadows and whispers, through the gaslit streets of Victorian London, and into a mystery wrapped in velvet darkness. This story is crafted for your peaceful rest, designed to slow your thoughts and guide you gently towards sleep. There is no urgency here, no need to hold on tightly to every detail. Simply let the words wash over you like waves upon a distant shore, and allow yourself to sink deeper and deeper into comfort with each passing moment. I wonder where you are listening from tonight, in what corner of our vast world you have found this quiet refuge. Now settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The fog had come to London, as it always did in late October, rolling up from the Thames like some ancient creature stirring from slumber, curling its grey tendrils around lampposts and through narrow alleyways, muffling the city's endless clamour into something softer, something almost gentle. Rain fell in a steady whisper against the windows of Baker Street, each droplet tracing silver paths down the glass, catching the warm amber glow from within. Inside number 221B, the fire crackled and murmured in its grate, sending dancing shadows across walls lined with books and scientific apparatus, creating patterns that seemed almost alive in their gentle movement. I sat in my usual chair, the leather worn smooth by countless evenings just like this one, a thick wool blanket draped across my knees, watching my friend Sherlock Holmes as he stood before the window, hands clasped behind his back, his tall silhouette perfectly still against the fog-obscured street beyond. He had been standing there for nearly an hour, barely moving, barely breathing it seemed, lost in some internal landscape of thought that I had long ago learned not to disturb. The tobacco smoke from his pipe drifted upward in lazy spirals, mingling with the firelight, adding its familiar earthy scent to the room's atmosphere of paper and old leather and burning coal. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea earlier, the good china rattling softly on the tray, steam rising from the pot in delicate wisps. She had set it on the small table between our chairs with her usual care, adding fresh cream and the sugar cubes Holmes preferred but rarely remembered to use, before retreating downstairs with a knowing smile and a gentle click of the door. The tea had cooled somewhat now, but I lifted my cup regardless, savouring its warmth against my palms, the subtle flavour of bergamot lingering on my tongue. Outside, the city continued its evening rhythms, muted and distant, the clip-clop of a late hansom cab passing by, the muffled call of a street vendor closing up his cart, all of it softened by fog and rain into something dreamlike, unreal. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, its brass pendulum catching the firelight with each swing, marking time in a way that seemed both urgent and utterly meaningless. Time moved differently on evenings like this, stretched out and thickened like honey, each moment extending into the next without clear boundaries. I found my eyes growing heavy, my thoughts beginning to wander down familiar paths, comfortable grooves worn by repetition and memory. How many such evenings had we passed this way, Holmes and I, in this room that had become more home than any place I had ever known? The rain continued its gentle percussion, a natural symphony that needed no conductor, no audience, simply existing in its own perfect rhythm. A log shifted in the fire suddenly, sending up a small shower of orange sparks, breaking the stillness with a soft crackle and pop that seemed enormously loud in the quiet room. Holmes stirred at the sound, turning slightly from the window, though his gaze remained fixed on something beyond my comprehension. He removed the pipe from his lips, studying it for a moment, as if seeing it for the first time, then moved with his characteristic fluid grace to refill it from the Persian slipper, where he kept his tobacco, performing the ritual with the careful attention of a priest conducting ceremony. The scratch of the match, the brief flare of sulphur, the first deep draw, creating a cherry-red glow in the pipe's bowl, all of it part of an ancient dance between man and contemplation. "Watson," he said at last, his voice quiet and thoughtful, barely rising above the fire's whisper. "Have you ever considered the symbolic nature of fog?" He did not wait for my answer, which was just as well, as I had none prepared. It obscures, certainly, but it also reveals. It strips away the familiar facades, reduces all things to their essential forms. In fog, a duke and a dustman become simply men, both equally lost, both equally seeking their way home. I smiled despite myself, recognizing the beginning of what would likely be an extended philosophical discourse. "And what brings such musings tonight, Holmes? Surely not simply the weather." He returned to his position at the window, pipe smoke wreathing his angular features, like a spirit seeking purchase. Perhaps I sense something approaching through this mist, Watson. Something that requires the fog to conceal it until the proper moment of revelation." His words hung in the air between us, neither quite serious nor entirely jest, occupying that strange middle ground where Holmes so often dwelt. The fire continued its work, consuming wood with patient thoroughness, transforming solid matter into warmth and light and memory. I set my teacup down with a gentle clink against the saucer, the sound seeming to travel further than it should in the enclosed space, rippling outward in invisible waves. My medical bag sat in its usual corner, leather darkened with age and use, brass fittings dulled to a soft gleam, a faithful companion on countless adventures through London streets and beyond. How many nights had it rested there, waiting, knowing that inevitably the peace would be broken by some knock upon the door, some desperate voice calling us out into the darkness. Before you fall asleep, write in the comments what time it is for you, and where you are from. As if summoned by my very thoughts, a sound emerged from the fog-wrapped street below, distinguishing itself from the rain's steady rhythm. Footsteps, measured and purposeful, drawing closer to our door. They stopped at the entrance, followed by the unmistakable creak of our gate, the one Mrs. Hudson always meant to oil, but somehow never did. Its rusty protest announcing visitors with reliable regularity. Holmes turned from the window at once, his entire demeanour shifting, the dreamy philosopher replaced instantly by the alert hunter, though he retained that outward appearance of casual ease that made him so effective at putting visitors at their ease. "A woman?" he announced quietly, his voice barely above a murmur. "Middle-aged, of good family, but fallen upon difficult circumstances. She comes not for herself, but for another, someone close to her heart, and she brings with her—" He paused, tilting his head slightly. "A mystery that smells of very old secrets indeed." I had long since ceased asking how he derived such conclusions from mere footsteps and the sound of a gate. The knock came moments later, firm but not aggressive, 3 sharp raps against wood that seemed to resonate through the entire house. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up from below, muffled pleasantries and the rustle of wet garments being taken, and then the creak of stairs as our visitor ascended toward us, each step announcing her progress, building anticipation like a conductor raising his baton before the orchestra's first note. Holmes moved to his chair, settling into it with the languid grace of a cat, steepling his fingers beneath his chin, his characteristic pose, eyes half closed but missing nothing. I straightened in my own seat, setting aside the blanket, assuming the role of witness and chronicler that I had occupied so many times before. The door opened, and Mrs. Hudson appeared, her round face flushed from the stairs, her eyes bright with that peculiar excitement that interesting visitors always sparked in her. "A Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, her voice carrying just the faintest note of approval. Mrs. Hudson had firm opinions about the quality of our visitors, and this one, it seemed, had passed some unspoken threshold of respectability. The woman who entered our chambers brought with her the smell of rain and old roses, a ghostly perfume that spoke of gardens long untended, of memories preserved in lavender and thyme. She was, as Holmes had predicted, of middle years, perhaps 50, with silver, threading through dark hair pulled back severely from a face that must once have been called handsome. Her clothes were well made but worn, cared for with the meticulous attention of someone who could no longer afford to replace them. Every button secured, every seam straight, speaking of pride maintained despite adversity. Her eyes, though, were what commanded attention, large and dark, and filled with a worry so profound it seemed to have weight, to pull at the very air around her. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice trembling slightly, musical despite its uncertainty. "I apologize for calling at such an hour, but I find myself quite desperate, and I was told, that is, everyone says, that you are the only one who might." "Please, Mrs. Blackwood," Holmes interrupted gently, gesturing to the chair opposite him, his voice taking on that particular warmth he reserved for the genuinely distressed. "Sit here by the fire and warm yourself. Watson, perhaps some of that tea, if it is still drinkable." He poured a cup himself, adding sugar without asking, somehow knowing it would be wanted, pressing it into her trembling hands with unexpected tenderness. She sat, the firelight painting her features in shades of amber and shadow, and for a moment said nothing, simply holding the cup as if it were the only solid thing in a world gone liquid and uncertain. The steam from Mrs. Blackwood's teacup rosium, from Mrs. Blackwood's teacup, rose in delicate spirals, catching the firelight and transforming into golden threads that dissolved into darkness near the ceiling. She watched these ephemeral patterns for a long moment, as if gathering courage from their dance, her lips moving silently, as though rehearsing words that seemed too strange to speak aloud. The rain had intensified slightly, its rhythm against the windows becoming more insistent, nature providing its own accompaniment to whatever tale was about to unfold. Holmes waited with the infinite patience of stone, his grey eyes fixed upon her face, with an intensity that might have been unsettling had it not been so clearly compassionate. I found myself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the palpable weight of mystery that seemed to emanate from this woman like perfume from a flower. "My brother," she began at last, her voice barely above a whisper, each word carefully chosen and placed, "has disappeared." She paused, took a small sip of tea, the cup rattling almost imperceptibly against the saucer as she set it down. "But that alone would not have brought me to your door, Mr. Holmes. Men disappear in London every day, do they not? They lose themselves in drink or gambling, or simply walk away from lives that have become unbearable. No, what brings me here is not the disappearance itself, but the manner of it, and the things he said before he vanished, and... She faltered, her eyes dropping to her hands, which twisted together in her lap like pale birds struggling against an invisible net. And the dragon. The word hung in the air between us, absurd and impossible, yet spoken with such deadly seriousness that neither Holmes nor I smiled. Outside, as if in response, the fog pressed closer against the windows, thick as wool, obscuring even the gas lamp directly across the street, transforming the world beyond our walls into nothing but grey emptiness. Holmes's fingers, still steepled beneath his chin, tapped together once, twice, a tiny gesture that I had learned to recognize as indicating heightened interest. "Tell me about your brother, Mrs. Blackwood," he said softly, his voice taking on that particular quality of gentle command that drew out confidences like a gardener coaxing forth reluctant blooms. "Begin wherever feels most natural, and omit no detail, however insignificant it may seem. Everything matters, even the things that appear to matter least." Mrs. Blackwood drew a long breath, her shoulders rising and falling, and when she spoke again, her voice had steadied, finding strength in the familiar territory of biography. "Edmund was 10 years my senior, Mr. Holmes. He is an antiquarian and scholar, specializing in medieval manuscripts and folklore. He has a small shop in Clerkenwell, tucked away on a street so narrow that carriages cannot pass, filled from floor to ceiling with books and documents that most would consider worthless rubbish. But Edmund sees treasure where others see decay. He can hold a fragment of parchment and tell you not only when it was written, but who might have written it, what they were feeling, what the weather was like that day." A faint smile ghosted across her features, born of obvious affection. "He lives alone above the shop, has never married, finding companionship enough in the company of the dead, as he often jokes." She paused to sip her tea again, and I noticed Holmes had produced his notebook, that battered leather volume that had witnessed the recording of countless mysteries, its pages filled with his peculiar shorthand that only he could decipher. The scratch of his pencil provided a gentle counterpoint to the rain's percussion, adding another layer to the room's symphony of small sounds. The fire continued its eternal consumption, never satisfied, always hungry, transforming matter into warmth with the slow magic of chemistry and time. 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Blackwood continued, her voice dropping lower, forcing us to lean closer to hear. "Edmund sent me a letter. He does this occasionally, though we see each other rarely, as I live with my daughter's family in Hampstead, and the journey is difficult for me. But this letter was different. His handwriting, usually so precise and elegant, was agitated, the letters uneven, ink blotted in places, as though his hand had trembled while writing. He spoke of a discovery, Mr. Holmes, something he had found in a collection of medieval documents he had purchased from an estate sale in Yorkshire. He would not tell me the nature of this discovery, said it was too dangerous to commit to paper, but he wrote that it concerned something called the Dragon Codex, a manuscript that supposedly did not exist, that scholars had dismissed as legend, a myth within a myth. Holmes's pencil stopped moving. "The Dragon Codex," he repeated softly, tasting the words. "Yes, I have encountered references to it in my own researches. A grimoire, supposedly compiled in the 13th century, containing knowledge deemed too dangerous for mortal minds. The church allegedly destroyed all copies in 1267, though rumours of its survival have persisted through the centuries like smoke that refuses to dissipate. Mrs. Blackwood nodded vigorously, relief washing over her features at finding her brother's obsession recognised and validated. Yes, exactly so. Edmund became consumed with this discovery, Mr. Holmes. He barely slept, barely ate. When I visited him a fortnight ago, I found him pale and drawn, his eyes fevered, surrounded by papers covered in strange symbols and diagrams. He spoke wildly of dragons sleeping beneath London, of ancient wards and protective seals, of something that had been contained for centuries but was now stirring, waking, preparing to emerge. A log in the fireplace chose that moment to collapse, sending up a shower of sparks and a sharp crack that made us all start slightly. The sudden sound seemed to break something in the room's atmosphere, allowing a chill to seep in despite the fire's warmth. Holmes rose from his chair with fluid grace, moving to poke at the fire with the brass iron, repositioning the logs with careful attention, sending new flames licking upward. While his back was turned, Mrs. Blackwood caught my eye, and in her gaze I saw not just worry, but fear, deep and primal, the kind that comes from confronting something that defies rational explanation. "Continue," Holmes said without turning, his voice slightly muffled, though I could detect the tension in it, the coiled readiness of a spring wound tight. What happened next? "He told me he had to perform a ritual," Mrs. Blackwood said, her words tumbling out faster now, as if speaking them quickly might rob them of their power to frighten. That the codex contained instructions for maintaining the seal, the dragon ward, and that it had not been performed in over a century. He said he could feel it, Mr. Holmes could feel the dragon moving in its sleep beneath the city, its dreams seeping upward through stone and earth, manifesting as fog, as this unnatural mist that has plagued London these past weeks. He said the ritual must be performed at a specific location, on a night when the fog was thickest, when the boundary between worlds grew thin. Holmes returned to his chair, settling back into it with a thoughtfulness that bordered on meditation. He reached for his pipe, found it had gone cold, and set it aside without attempting to relight it. "And when did you last see your brother, Mrs. Blackwood?" 5 days ago, she whispered, and now tears began to track down her cheeks, though she made no move to wipe them away. "He came to my door in Hampstead at dawn, wild-eyed, carrying a leather satchel that he clutched as if it contained all the treasures of the world. He said he had found the location, an old church in Suffolk, St. Olave's, built over Roman foundations, over something older still. He said he was going to perform the ritual that night, that he had no choice, that if he did not, the dragon would wake fully, and London would burn." She paused, her voice breaking. "I begged him not to go, Mr. Holmes. I told him it was madness, that he needed rest and medical attention. But he simply kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and asked me to forgive him if he failed." The clock ticked on, indifferent to human drama, marking time with mechanical precision. Outside, somewhere in the fog-wrapped city, a dog began to bark, a lonely sound that was quickly swallowed by the mist. Holmes sat perfectly still, his eyes closed now, processing information with that remarkable mind that could see patterns where others saw only chaos, connections where others found only disconnection. "You went to the police, I presume?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "They laughed at me," Mrs. Blackwood said bitterly. "They said Edmund was clearly suffering from mental strain, that he would return when he grew hungry or cold enough, that I should not worry myself. But I went to St. Olave's, Mr. Holmes. The next morning, when he did not return, I took a cab to Southwark and found the church. It was locked, abandoned, scheduled for demolition, but the lock had been forced, and inside... She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself, despite the fire's warmth. Inside, there were signs of occupation. Candles burned down to stubs, strange symbols chalked upon the floor in patterns that hurt to look at, and Edmund's satchel, empty, abandoned near the altar. But no sign of my brother, Mr. Holmes. No sign at all, except... She reached into her reticule with trembling fingers, withdrawing something wrapped in cloth. Except this. She unwrapped the object carefully, revealing it to be a small figurine, perhaps 4 inches tall, carved from some dark stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the firelight. It depicted a serpentine creature coiled upon itself, wings folded, eyes rendered as empty hollows that nonetheless seemed to watch, to judge, to know. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every scale individually rendered, every claw sharp enough to draw blood, the whole thing radiating a sense of age and otherness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand upright. Holmes took the figurine from her, holding it up to the light, turning it slowly, examining it from every angle with the focused intensity of a jeweler appraising a diamond. Remarkable, he murmured, and I could hear genuine wonder in his voice. 12th century, I should say, possibly earlier. The style suggests pre-Norman craftsmanship, though the dragon motif is unusual for that period in England. Where precisely did you find this, Mrs. Blackwood? Clutched in the hand of Edmund's coat, she replied, her voice barely audible now. The coat itself lay near the altar, as if he had shed it in haste, but this was gripped so tightly in the pocket that I had to pry the fabric apart to retrieve it. Holmes set the figurine on the table between us with surprising gentleness, as if it might shatter, or perhaps as if it might bite. The dragon figurine sat upon the table like a small monument to forgotten things, its dark stone surface seeming to drink in the amber firelight rather than reflect it, creating a tiny pool of shadow that defied the illumination surrounding it. Holmes had not taken his eyes from the object, his long fingers hovering above it, as if he could divine its secrets through proximity alone, as if the very air around it might whisper truths that sight could not reveal. The rain had softened to a gentle patter now, less insistent, more contemplative, like the tapping of thoughtful fingers against glass. I found myself transfixed by the figurine as well, by the way those hollow eye sockets seemed to follow movement, even though I knew rationally that they could not, that it was merely trick of shadow and firelight playing upon ancient stone. Mrs. Blackwood had settled deeper into her chair, the telling of her tale having exhausted some reserve of energy she had been hoarding. Her teacup sat forgotten in her lap, the liquid within gone cold, a thin skin forming across its surface. She watched Holmes with an expression caught between hope and apprehension, as if afraid that he too might dismiss her concerns as the ravings of an overwrought woman, that she might leave this warm room no better equipped to find her brother than when she had entered. But Holmes, I knew, dismissed nothing without thorough examination, treated every mystery with the same grave attention, whether it involved crown jewels or a missing cat. Mrs. Blackwood, Holmes said at last, his voice emerging from contemplation, like a diver surfacing from deep waters. I should very much like to examine your brother's shop and the church where you found this remarkable artifact. But the hour grows late, and you look quite spent. Watson, would you be so kind as to arrange for a cab to return Mrs. Blackwood to Hampstead? She should rest, for I suspect we shall have need of her detailed knowledge in the days ahead. I rose immediately, grateful for the opportunity to move, to break the strange tension that had built in the room like pressure before a storm. As I moved toward the door, I heard Holmes continue speaking, his tone gentle but firm. You must not lose hope. Your brother is an intelligent man, clearly resourceful, and his disappearance, while mysterious, does not necessarily indicate tragedy. Men consumed by scholarly pursuits often lose track of time and conventional obligations. He may yet return with a perfectly rational explanation that will make us all feel quite foolish for our concern. Yet, even as he spoke these comforting words, I caught his expression in the mirror above the mantelpiece, saw the tightness around his eyes that suggested he believed no such thing, that his mind had already begun constructing darker possibilities, threading together facts into patterns that only he could yet perceive. I descended the stairs to arrange the cab, leaving them in that firelit space, the detective and the worried sister, the ancient figurine sitting between them, like a small dark bridge spanning centuries. The fog outside had thickened impossibly, transforming Baker Street into something from a fever dream. Gas lamps reduced to pale smudges of light, floating in grey emptiness. The cab, when it arrived, materialized from this murk like a ghost ship emerging from supernatural seas, the horse's breath adding its own contribution to the mist, the driver's face barely visible beneath his waterproof cape. Mrs. Blackwood descended our steps with renewed composure, having been fortified by Holmes's assurances, and, I suspected, by the simple relief of having shared her burden with someone who took it seriously. "Thank you, Dr. Watson," she murmured as I helped her into the cab, pressing a card into my hand with her Hampstead address written in neat script. "Please tell Mr. Holmes that I am at his disposal any hour should he require further information. Edmund is all the family I have left in this world." Her eyes, red-rimmed but no longer streaming tears, met mine with an intensity that was almost physical. "Find him, Doctor, please." The cab pulled away, swallowed almost instantly by fog, the sound of hoofbeats fading to nothing within seconds. I stood for a moment on the pavement, letting the mist settle upon my face and hands, feeling its cool touch, its strange weight. London had seen many fogs in my years residing here, but this one felt different somehow, possessed of an unusual density, an almost tangible quality that made breathing feel like drawing water into the lungs. Nonsense, of course, the product of Mrs. Blackwood's tale working upon my imagination. But nonetheless, I found myself hurrying back inside, climbing the familiar 17 steps with unusual haste, eager to return to firelight and rationality. Holmes had moved to his chemical table during my absence. The dragon figurine, now positioned beneath a magnifying glass, mounted on an adjustable arm, illuminated by the bright flame of a spirit lamp. He bent over it like a priest at prayer, his aquiline profile sharp against the lamplight, muttering to himself in that way he had when his mind raced too quickly for speech to keep pace with thought. I knew better than to interrupt, so I busied myself adding coal to the fire, which had begun to burn low, then settled back into my chair to observe and wait. The clock struck midnight, its chimes rolling through the room like gentle waves, marking the transition from one day to the next. Holmes straightened suddenly, as if the sound had broken some spell, turning to face me with an expression I had seen before, a mixture of excitement and unease that appeared when he encountered something that challenged even his comprehensive knowledge. "Watson," he said, moving toward me with quick steps, "this figurine is quite genuine, dating to approximately the 11th century, possibly earlier. The stone is a type of basalt found primarily in volcanic regions, certainly not native to England. More curious still, there are traces of substances in the carved grooves, residues that suggest regular anointing with oils and perhaps blood. This object was not merely decorative, my friend. It was functional, used in rituals, ceremonies, practices that modern man has forgotten or chosen to forget." He began to pace, a sure sign that his mental machinery had engaged fully, processing and analyzing, constructing theories and immediately testing them against available evidence. The Dragon Codex, assuming it exists beyond legend, would represent a remarkable historical find. Medieval grimoires are not uncommon, but one specifically focused on draconic law, on the management and containment of such creatures. That would be extraordinary. Dragons appear in the folklore of every culture. Watson, from China to Scandinavia, from Persia to Wales. Why? What psychological or perhaps historical truth lies beneath these universal myths? I had no answer, and he expected none, his questions rhetorical, tools for organizing his own thoughts. Outside, the fog pressed against our windows with what seemed like conscious intent, as if it too listened to Holmes's theorizing, as if it had opinions on the matter at hand. The fire crackled softly, settling into a steady burn that would last until dawn if left untended, providing both warmth and the deep comfort that only fire can offer, that ancient reassurance predating civilization itself. Holmes suddenly ceased his pacing, standing perfectly still in the center of the room, his head tilted as if listening to something beyond normal hearing. "Do you hear that, Watson?" he asked softly. I strained my ears, pushing past the familiar sounds of rain and fire and ticking clock. And yes, there was something else. A low rumble so deep it was felt more than heard, resonating up through the floorboards, through the very bones of the building. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, then faded into nothing, leaving behind only uncertainty about whether it had occurred at all. "Thunder," I suggested, though the sound had been nothing like any thunder I had encountered. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, but his tone suggested he entertained other possibilities. "Or perhaps Mrs. Blackwood's dragon dreams more actively tonight." He smiled then, a quick flash that was meant to indicate he jested, but I saw his hand tremble slightly as he reached for his pipe, saw the way his eyes returned again and again to the small stone figure that watched us from its place beneath the magnifying glass. He spent the next hour making notes in his commonplace books, those repositories of odd facts and stranger theories that he maintained with religious dedication, occasionally asking me to read passages from various reference works he pulled from our shelves. We explored dragons in mythology, medieval religious practices, the history of Suffolk, the archaeological record of Roman London, each avenue of inquiry opening onto a dozen others, creating a labyrinth of information through which Holmes navigated with the confidence of long practice. I felt myself growing drowsy, despite the mystery's pull, the warmth and the late hour combining to make my eyelids heavy, my thoughts soft and unmoored. "You should rest, Watson," Holmes said, without looking up from his notes. Tomorrow we visit Clerkenwell and Edmund Blackwood's shop. I wish to see what our missing antiquarian found so compelling. What discovery drove him to abandoned churches and desperate rituals? There may be nothing in this but a scholar's breakdown, a mind too long immersed in ancient terrors, finally unable to distinguish past from present, legend from reality. But that figurine troubles me, my friend. It speaks of something authentic, something real and old and patient. I rose stiffly, my muscles protesting the long stillness, and bid Holmes good night, though I suspected he would see no bed this evening, would still be sitting there when dawn painted the windows grey, surrounded by books and theories and the small stone dragon that seemed to grow larger in my memory with each moment I was absent from its presence. I climbed to my room, undressed mechanically, and fell into bed with the grateful surrender of the thoroughly exhausted. But sleep, when it came, brought no rest. I dreamed of fog that moved with purpose, of shadows with scales and wings, of a rumbling beneath London streets that grew louder and louder until the entire city shook. Buildings crumbling, streets splitting open to reveal depths that had no business existing. And everywhere the fog, thick as wool, hiding what rose from below, concealing the shape of the thing that had been sleeping so long, too long, and was now finally, terribly, waking up. Sensory immersion. Morning arrived, not with light, but with a gradual lessening of darkness. The fog so dense that sunrise became merely a suggestion, a slight warming of grey to pearl, as if the sun itself struggled to penetrate the strange veil that had settled over London. I woke with a gasp, my nightshirt damp with perspiration, despite the room's chill. Fragments of dreams still clinging to consciousness, like cobwebs that refused to be brushed away. The rumbling from my sleep seemed to echo still in my ears, though the house around me stood silent, save for the familiar creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to temperature. The distant clatter of Mrs. Hudson beginning her morning routines in the kitchen below. I rose and moved to the window, drawing back the curtain to peer out at Baker Street, finding it transformed into something alien and unknowable. The fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, swirling in patterns that suggested intentionality, purpose, as if great invisible creatures moved through it just beyond sight. A milk cart passed below, the horse's form barely visible, reduced to a suggestion of movement, and the muffled sound of hooves on cobblestones. The milk bottles rattled their familiar song, that quintessentially British percussion that marked morning's arrival in every corner of the city. A sound so ordinary it provided strange comfort against the extraordinary atmosphere that surrounded it. I dressed quickly, my fingers fumbling slightly with collar studs and cufflinks, my mind still half tangled in dreams of scales and wings and darkness rising. Descending to our sitting room, I found Holmes exactly where I had left him, though he had changed his position, now reclining in his chair with his eyes closed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. For a moment, I thought he slept, but then he spoke without opening his eyes, his voice hoarse from disuse, and probably from too much pipe tobacco. The fog has not lifted, Watson. If anything, it has intensified. Most remarkable. The meteorological conditions required to sustain such density for so prolonged a period are quite unusual, suggesting atmospheric pressures and temperature gradients that should not coexist in this season. He opened his eyes then, grey as the fog itself, red-rimmed from his sleepless night, but alive with that peculiar intensity that seized him when a problem demanded his complete attention. Mrs. Hudson has prepared breakfast, though I confess I have no appetite. You should eat, however. We have a journey ahead of us, and I suspect it may prove more taxing than a simple visit to a bookshop would typically warrant. The breakfast Mrs. Hudson had laid out was hearty and warm. Kippers and eggs and toast with marmalade, strong tea that steamed invitingly in the pot. I ate while Holmes watched, occasionally making notes in his book, once rising to consult a map of London he had spread across his desk, tracing routes with his finger, murmuring calculations of distance and time. The dragon figurine remained on the side table, and I found my eyes drawn to it repeatedly, unable to shake the feeling that it observed us, that those empty eye sockets contained some awareness that predated human civilization, that remembered things better left forgotten. By 9 o'clock, we had prepared for departure, Holmes donning his long coat and deerstalker, I in my sturdiest walking clothes, and bringing my medical bag more from habit than any clear expectation of need. We descended to the street where the fog enveloped us immediately, reducing visibility to perhaps 10 feet, transforming the familiar into the strange. Holmes moved through it with confidence born of intimate knowledge, navigating Baker Street's geography from memory, leading us toward the main thoroughfare where we might secure transportation. A hansom cab emerged from the greyness like an apparition, and Holmes hailed it with a sharp whistle that seemed muffled and deadened by the thick air. The driver, bundled against the damp, peered down at us with an expression of resignation. "Where to, gentlemen? Though I'll warn you, travel's slow this morning. Can barely see the horse's head from my perch." "Clerkenwell," Holmes replied, providing an address on a narrow street I did not recognize. "Take your time, driver. Safety over speed today." We climbed inside, settling onto leather seats worn smooth by countless passengers, the cab's interior smelling of damp wool and old tobacco, enclosed spaces that had witnessed 1,000 private conversations, 1,000 small dramas of city life. The horse began its laborious progress, the driver calling out occasional warnings to unseen pedestrians, the fog transforming London into a maze where only sound provided guidance. Church bells tolled the hour somewhere to our left, muffled and distant. A street vendor's cry advertised chestnuts, though we saw no sign of the vendor himself. Voices drifted past, disembodied and strange, conversations cut short by distance and mist. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his sharp gaze directed at nothing, turned inward to examine the problem from every angle. I knew this mood, had witnessed it countless times. The great detective's mind sorting through facts like a jeweler examining stones, discarding the flawed, polishing the promising, searching always for that one perfect gem of truth that would illuminate everything else. The journey that should have taken 15 minutes stretched to 30, then 40, the horse picking its way carefully through streets that might as well have been country roads for all we could see of London's usual bustle and density. When we finally arrived at the address Holmes had provided, the cab driver seemed as relieved as we to end the journey. Holmes paid him generously, adding extra for the difficulty of the travel, and we stood for a moment on the narrow pavement, letting the fog swirl around us, trying to orient ourselves in this pocket of London that felt removed from the city proper, forgotten by time and progress. The street was indeed too narrow for carriages, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, lined with buildings that leaned toward each other overhead, like old men sharing secrets, their upper stories nearly touching across the gap. Edmund Blackwood's shop occupied the ground floor of one such building, its presence announced by a weathered sign hanging above the door. E. Blackwood, Antiquarian Books and Manuscripts, by appointment. The windows on either side of the entrance were so crowded with books that no interior was visible, volumes stacked and piled without apparent order, their spines facing in all directions, creating a wall of leather and cloth and crumbling paper. The door itself was painted a dark green. The colour faded to something closer to grey, and when Holmes tried the handle, it opened without resistance, unlocked despite the owner's absence. We stepped inside, and immediately the fog seemed to recede, replaced by a different kind of obscurity. The dimness of a space lit only by what little daylight could penetrate the book-crowded windows and the narrow street beyond. The smell hit first, overwhelming in its intensity. Old paper and leather, dust and mildew, ink and glue, and the particular mustiness that only truly ancient documents possess. A scent that spoke of centuries compressed into confined space. My eyes adjusted slowly, revealing a room so packed with books and manuscripts that movement required careful navigation. Narrow pathways winding between towers of texts that reached from floor to ceiling, creating a labyrinth of scholarship and obsession. Holmes stood just inside the doorway, absorbing the scene with that total attention he brought to crime scenes and significant spaces, cataloguing everything, missing nothing. "Remarkable," he breathed, and I heard genuine admiration in his voice. "This is not the collection of a mere dealer, Watson. This is the life's work of a true scholar, a man who valued knowledge above comfort, above convention, perhaps above sanity itself." A candle had burned down to nothing on a desk near the rear of the shop, leaving a pool of hardened wax and a brass holder sitting in its centre like an island. Papers covered every surface, some weighted down with stones or other books, others scattered as if abandoned mid-work. Holmes moved toward the desk with careful steps, and I followed, both of us instinctively keeping our voices low, as if the accumulated scholarship surrounding us demanded reverence, silence, the respect one might show in a cathedral or tomb. The desk itself was a chaos of research, covered in Edmund Blackwood's handwriting, which ranged from neat academic script to frenzied scrawling that was barely legible. Holmes began examining these papers systematically, occasionally handing one to me to hold or read, his fingers moving with delicate precision, treating each document as if it might crumble at rough handling. I saw diagrams of strange symbols, copies of medieval manuscript pages, translations from Latin and what appeared to be older languages still, notes about dragons and wards and protective seals, references to churches and Roman ruins and underground rivers. Then Holmes stopped, his hand hovering over a particular sheet, his entire body going still in that way that indicated a significant discovery. He lifted the paper carefully, holding it toward what little light existed, and I moved closer to see what had captured his attention. It was a map, hand-drawn but remarkably detailed, showing a section of Southwark, the Thames running along one edge, streets labelled in Edmund's neat hand. But over this ordinary city map, he had drawn another layer in red ink, showing what appeared to be underground structures, tunnels and chambers. A network beneath the streets that no modern map would acknowledge. At the centre of this hidden architecture, directly beneath St. Olave's church. Edmund had drawn a symbol that made my breath catch. A dragon, coiled upon itself, surrounded by words in a language I did not recognize. And around the entire design, a circle broken in one place, as if whatever it contained had found or created an opening, a way through or out. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, and I heard something in his voice I had rarely encountered. Something that might have been fear, or might have been excitement, or might have been both intertwined. "I believe we are looking at something quite extraordinary. Edmund Blackwood was not mad. He may have been the sanest man in London." At that precise moment, a tremendous crash echoed from somewhere above us. The sound of heavy objects falling, of wood splintering, of something large moving through the upper floor of the building. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the towers of books around us swayed precariously, threatening to collapse and bury us beneath centuries of accumulated knowledge. Holmes and I froze, our eyes meeting in the dimness. The map still held between us, the dragon symbol seeming to pulse with meaning in the uncertain light. And from above came another sound, deliberate and purposeful, the unmistakable tread of footsteps moving through Edmund Blackwood's private rooms, searching for something, or perhaps searching for us. Sensory immersion. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of grey light that penetrated Edmund Blackwood's shop, swirling like tiny galaxies disturbed by the violence of sound from above, each particle catching what little illumination existed and transforming it into something almost beautiful, almost peaceful, despite the circumstances that had set them into motion. Holmes's hand had moved instinctively to my arm, his grip firm but not painful, a silent communication that meant caution, stillness, the predator's awareness that movement attracts attention, while stillness renders one invisible. We stood there among the towers of books, breathing shallowly, listening with every fibre of our being to the sounds that filtered down through aged floorboards, trying to distinguish intent from accident, danger from coincidence. The footsteps continued their progress overhead, deliberate and unhurried, moving from what I estimated to be the front of the building toward the rear, pausing occasionally as if whoever walked above us stopped to examine something, to search through drawers or cupboards, to assess and evaluate. The rhythm was methodical, professional even, lacking the frantic energy of a common burglar, suggesting instead someone who knew what they sought, who had perhaps been here before, who understood the space's geography with the confidence of familiarity. Another crash followed, lighter this time, the sound of books being swept from a shelf or table, cascading to the floor in a papery avalanche that sent fresh dust filtering down upon us like fine snow. Holmes released my arm and moved with extraordinary care toward the narrow staircase at the shop's rear, each step placed with the precision of a cat stalking through tall grass, his body low, his movements fluid and controlled. I followed as best I could, though I lacked his natural grace, feeling clumsy and loud despite my efforts at silence. The stairs were steep and creaked abominably, each tread announcing our ascent despite our caution. But the noise from above continued unabated, suggesting our intruder remained focused on their own activities, unaware or unconcerned about potential witnesses below. The upper floor, when we reached it, opened into a single large room that served as Edmund Blackwood's living quarters, and the scene that greeted us spoke of both scholarly dedication and recent violence. Books lined every wall here as well, but these were different from the shop's inventory. Personal volumes annotated and marked. Favourite texts kept close at hand. A narrow bed occupied one corner, neatly made, suggesting its owner had not slept in it for several nights at least. A small kitchen area contained a spirit stove and simple cooking implements, all clean and orderly. But the centre of the room had been thoroughly ransacked, furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor like autumn leaves after a storm, cushions sliced open with their stuffing pulled out in great handfuls, the methodical destruction of someone searching desperately for something small enough to hide. And in the midst of this chaos stood a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb what little light existed, his face obscured by a scarf wrapped around the lower half, leaving only his eyes visible. And those eyes were pale, almost colourless, like ice or fog given form. He had been rifling through a desk drawer when we appeared, and he turned to face us with startling speed for someone of his size, his hand moving toward his coat pocket in a gesture that promised violence, that spoke of weapons and willingness to use them. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice muffled by the scarf, but surprisingly cultured, educated, the accent suggesting good breeding and expensive schools. "I'm afraid you've arrived at an inconvenient moment. I would strongly suggest you return to the street and forget you saw anything here. This matter doesn't concern you, and involving yourselves further would be most unwise." Holmes had gone perfectly still, his body relaxed but ready, his eyes fixed on the intruder with that peculiar intensity that seemed to strip away pretense and see directly into a person's core. "I think you'll find," he said calmly, his voice carrying no trace of fear or even particular concern, "that this matter concerns us very much. We are here at the request of Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood, searching for her missing brother Edmund. And you, I suspect, are searching for the same thing we are, though perhaps for different reasons. The Dragon Codex, unless I miss my guess." The man's pale eyes widened fractionally, the only sign of surprise in his otherwise controlled demeanour. His hand remained near his pocket, but had ceased its threatening movement. "Sherlock Holmes," he said, and it was not a question. "I should have anticipated your involvement. The sister would naturally seek out London's most celebrated detective when the police proved unhelpful. But you are meddling in affairs beyond your understanding, Mr. Holmes. There are forces at work here that do not respond to logic and deduction, that exist outside the comfortable rationality you inhabit." "Then perhaps you might educate me," Holmes replied, his tone conversational, as if they discussed nothing more consequential than the weather or the results of a cricket match. "I am always eager to expand my understanding, to venture beyond comfortable rationality into whatever territory truth demands. Who are you, and what is your interest in Edmund Blackwood and his discoveries?" The man hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw calculation, weighing options, assessing risks and potential benefits. The fog pressed against the room's single window, creating a grey screen that made the space feel isolated, removed from the normal world, a pocket outside regular time and space, where ordinary rules might not apply. From somewhere far below, London continued its muffled existence, the city carrying on with business and routine, unaware of or indifferent to the small drama playing out in this forgotten corner of Clerkenwell. "My name," the man said finally, "is of no consequence, but you may call me Graves if a name is required for the comfort of discourse. I represent certain interests, Mr. Holmes, ancient organizations that have existed far longer than your British Empire, that predate Christianity itself, that remember things your civilization has worked very hard to forget. We are keepers of boundaries, maintainers of seals, watchers of the places where the old world and the new overlap, where things that should remain buried occasionally stir and threaten to rise. He moved slowly away from the desk, his hands now visible and empty, a gesture of truce, or at least temporary peace. Edmund Blackwood stumbled upon something he should not have, knowledge that was deliberately hidden, scattered, made difficult to piece together, precisely because complete understanding would prove dangerous. The Dragon Codex is not a single manuscript, Mr. Holmes, but a collection of documents, fragments gathered over centuries, each piece harmless on its own, but devastating when assembled. Blackwood managed to gather enough pieces to understand what lay beneath London, beneath St. Olaf's specifically, and worse still, he believed he could perform the ritual to reinforce the wards, to ensure the seal remained intact. Holmes had begun moving around the room's perimeter, his eyes cataloguing the destruction, occasionally bending to examine a torn paper or displaced object. But the ritual went wrong, he said quietly, not looking at Graves, but somehow maintaining the conversation's thread. Or perhaps it went right in ways Edmund did not anticipate. He disappeared, and now you search his rooms, looking for what? The codex itself, or evidence of what occurred during the ritual. Graves laughed, a short, bitter sound devoid of humour. Both, neither. I search for anything that might indicate whether Blackwood succeeded in reinforcing the seal, or whether he, in his amateur enthusiasm, actually damaged it, weakened it, created the very opening he sought to prevent. The fog, Mr. Holmes, this unnatural mist that has choked London for weeks, is not meteorological in origin. It is a manifestation, a symptom of something stirring below, of dreams seeping upward from a consciousness that should remain dormant. If the seal is broken, if even a crack has formed. He trailed off, and I saw his hand tremble slightly before he clenched it into a fist, forcing stillness. You think me mad, I'm certain, a raving lunatic speaking of dragons and ancient seals as if they were proven facts. But I assure you, gentlemen, there are more things beneath London's streets than sewers and buried rivers. The Romans knew it, built their temples carefully, avoided certain areas despite prime locations. The medieval church understood it, erected specific structures over specific sites, performed rituals disguised as Christian ceremony to maintain protections far older than their religion. We inherit this knowledge, this burden, this eternal vigilance. Holmes had stopped his circuit of the room, standing now before a bookshelf that had somehow survived the ransacking intact. He pulled a volume from it, examining the spine, then the interior, his fingers moving across pages with gentle reverence. The Book of Kells contains marginalia, he said, seemingly apropos of nothing. Decorative elements that include numerous serpentine creatures, dragons intertwined with religious imagery. Medieval scholars dismissed these as mere artistic flourish, fantasy to fill empty spaces. But what if they were not decoration, but documentation? What if the monks who created such works were recording what they knew, what they had been taught to watch for, concealing true knowledge within acceptable religious art? Graves moved closer, his earlier hostility replaced by something like respect. or perhaps recognition of a kindred intellect. Precisely so, Mr. Holmes. You begin to understand. The dragon is not metaphor, but memory, not symbol, but species. Something that existed before humanity claimed dominion, that retreated underground when the surface became inhospitable, that sleeps but does not die, that dreams and in dreaming affects the world above in subtle ways. London sits atop a nexus, Mr. Holmes, a convergence of underground waterways and geological formations that create natural chambers, spaces large enough to house something. He paused, searching for words. Something of considerable size. A sound erupted from below us then, the shop door banging open with sudden violence, followed by heavy footsteps, multiple sets, ascending the stairs with no attempt at stealth or caution. Graves's entire demeanour changed instantly, his body coiling with tension, his hand disappearing into his coat and emerging with a small revolver that gleamed dully in the grey light. "Quickly," he hissed, moving toward the room's single window, fumbling with the latch. "They found me. If you value your lives and your sanity, come with me now and ask questions later." Holmes looked at me, and in his eyes I saw that familiar calculation, that rapid assessment of risk versus potential reward that had led us into danger countless times before, but had also solved mysteries that would otherwise have remained forever obscure. He nodded once, sharply, and we moved toward Graves as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. As the door burst inward, revealing 3 figures dressed in long coats, their faces covered by masks fashioned to resemble birds of prey, beaked and terrible, their gloved hands holding implements that gleamed with edges too sharp, too purposeful, designed for cutting through resistance, both material and living. Graves had the window open, revealing a narrow ledge beyond, a precarious path along the building's exterior that led toward an adjacent rooftop. "This way," he commanded, and without hesitation he slipped through the opening, his large frame moving with surprising agility onto the ledge, disappearing into the fog that clung to the building like grey wool. Holmes followed immediately, and then it was my turn, the window frame rough against my hands, the fog cold and wet against my face, the ledge beneath my feet barely wider than my boots, nothing but 4 stories of empty air and hard cobblestones waiting below if I should slip, should lose my balance, should make one wrong step in this grey blindness that had swallowed London whole. The fog became not obstacle, but ally in those desperate moments, wrapping around us like a pre-rate moments, wrapping around us like a protective shroud, concealing our flight along the narrow ledge while simultaneously obscuring our destination, creating a world reduced to mere inches of visibility, to the rough brick beneath my fingertips, to the sound of my own breath loud in my ears, to the precipitous void that yawned invisibly to my right. Patient and waiting, I pressed myself against the building's facade, feeling the cold, damp stone through my coat, inching forward with painful slowness, following the darker shape ahead that I assumed was Holmes, trusting in Graves somewhere beyond him, leading us towards safety, or perhaps towards something else entirely, some fate we could not yet perceive through the grey curtain that had swallowed the world. Behind us, muffled by fog and distance, came the sounds of our pursuers reaching the window. Exclamations in a language I did not recognize, harsh syllables that carried threat even without comprehension. Then silence, and that silence proved more terrifying than noise, suggesting they had chosen not to follow along the ledge, but but to find another route, to cut us off perhaps, to anticipate our destination and wait there with their terrible beaked masks and gleaming implements. My foot slipped slightly on moss or ice or simply worn stone, and for one heart-stopping moment I teetered, my balance shifting toward the void, my arms windmilling uselessly, before my hand found purchase on a window frame, arresting my fall, allowing me to press back against the wall, with a gasp that came out as a prayer of gratitude to whatever forces governed the survival of foolish men on foggy ledges. The ledge widened ahead, merging with a flat roof that belonged to the adjacent building, and Graves had already reached this relative safety, turning back to offer his hand as first Holmes and then I scrambled onto the blessed horizontal surface, no longer inches from death with every step. We crouched there in the fog, catching our breath, the roof's tarred surface solid and real beneath us. Small stones and debris scattered across it, evidence of neglect, of a space humans rarely visited. From somewhere below came the normal sounds of London continuing its business. Cartwheels on cobblestones, voices calling out wares, a dog barking its territorial claims, all of it strangely distant, as if we occupied a different plane of existence, a layer above the regular world where different rules applied. "They will pursue us," Graves whispered, his breath creating small clouds that merged with the surrounding fog. The brotherhood of the watching eye does not abandon a hunt once begun, but we have a few minutes' advantage, and I know these rooftops have mapped them over years of necessity. Follow me, step where I step, and for God's sake, gentlemen, do not look down. He moved away with the confidence of long practice, and we followed, because the alternative was to remain stationary and wait for the bird-masked hunters to find us. The rooftops of Clerkenwell formed an archipelago of relative safety, separated by gaps that required jumping, by slopes that threatened to send us sliding toward edges and the long fall beyond. Graves navigated this treacherous geography with the ease of a mountain goat, leaping across spaces that seemed too wide, scrambling up slopes too steep, moving always with purpose, with direction, leading us in what I gradually realized was a deliberate pattern, not random flight, but calculated journey towards some specific destination. We descended eventually via a fire escape, so rusted I feared it might collapse beneath our weight, the metal groaning and creaking but holding, delivering us into a narrow courtyard, enclosed by buildings on all sides, a pocket of space invisible from any street, accessible only by those who knew it existed. Graves paused here, listening intently, his head cocked like a hound scenting the air, before nodding to himself and moving toward a door so weathered and nondescript it might have been part of the wall itself. He produced a key from somewhere within his coat, and the lock turned with a well-oiled click that spoke of regular use, of maintenance, of importance despite the derelict appearance. Inside, we found ourselves in what appeared to be an old warehouse, long abandoned by its original purpose, now filled with dust and shadows and the particular smell of enclosed spaces, where air moves rarely and time accumulates in visible layers. But Graves moved through this space with the familiarity of ownership, leading us past empty crates and broken machinery toward a corner where a heavy curtain concealed an opening. And through this opening lay something entirely unexpected, a room that glowed with lamplight, furnished with comfortable chairs and a table laden with maps and books, walls hung with diagrams and charts, a command post or study, a place where serious work occurred far from official eyes. "Sit, please," Graves said, removing his scarf at last to reveal features that matched his cultured voice. A face perhaps 50 years old, weathered but distinguished, marked by experiences that had etched lines around his eyes and mouth. The face of someone who had seen much and believed more. He moved to a cabinet, producing a bottle of brandy and 3 glasses without asking permission, pouring generous measures and pressing them into our hands. "You'll need this, I think. The cold, the fear, the reality of what you've just witnessed, all demand fortification." The brandy burned pleasantly as it descended, spreading warmth through my chest, steadying nerves that had been jangled by our rooftop flight. Holmes accepted his glass, but did not drink immediately, instead watching Graves with that penetrating gaze that had unravelled so many mysteries, that saw patterns where others found only chaos. "The Brotherhood of the Watching Eye," he said, quietly. "I have encountered references to such an organization in my researches, though I confess I dismissed them as fantasy, secret societies existing more in imagination than reality. You will forgive my skepticism, Mr. Graves, but the events of this morning stretch credulity somewhat." Graves smiled without humour, settling into a chair with the sigh of a man carrying burdens too heavy for easy bearing. "Skepticism is healthy, Mr. Holmes, and in most circumstances I would encourage it. But we have moved beyond the realm where skepticism serves any useful purpose. Those men who pursued us, who ransacked Edmund Blackwood's rooms, they are members of an opposing faction, a group that calls itself the Order of the Unsealing. Where we work to maintain the ancient wards, they seek to break them, to wake what sleeps, to unleash forces they believe will restore some imagined golden age, some lost paradise that never truly existed save in the fevered dreams of madmen and prophets." He drank deeply from his glass, then leaned forward, his pale eyes intense in the lamplight. "London sits atop a sleeping god, gentlemen, not a metaphorical god, not some allegorical representation, but an actual living entity, vast and ancient, that entered dormancy millennia ago when atmospheric conditions changed, when the world became inhospitable to its kind. The Romans encountered evidence of it, incorporated its containment into their own civic planning, built specific structures aligned with specific purposes. When Rome fell and darkness covered Britain, the knowledge persisted in oral traditions, in practices disguised as pagan ritual, eventually absorbed and preserved by the Church, which understood that some truths transcended theology. Holmes had begun pacing, a sure sign that his formidable mind worked at full capacity, processing, analyzing, testing theories against available evidence. "You speak of a dragon, Mr. Graves. Not a symbolic dragon, but a biological entity, a creature of flesh and blood, and presumably considerable size. Such a being would require sustenance, would produce waste, would leave evidence of its existence beyond folklore and manuscript illuminations. Where is this evidence?" "Beneath your feet," Graves replied simply. Miles of tunnel networks, natural caverns expanded over centuries, underground rivers that flow through chambers large enough to house cathedrals. The London you know, Mr. Holmes, is merely a skin stretched over something far older, far deeper, far stranger than most humans can comfortably contemplate. And the dragon, if we must use that inadequate term, does not require sustenance as you understand it. It feeds on geothermal energy, on the heat of the Earth's core, on forces we barely comprehend with our limited science. It has been asleep for over 2,000 years, its metabolism slowed to near stasis, its dreams the only evidence of continued consciousness. The room had grown colder despite the lamps, or perhaps that was merely my imagination, my body responding to words that challenged every comfortable assumption about reality, about the city I called home, about the ground beneath buildings I had walked past 1,000 times without second thought. I finished my brandy and welcomed the warmth it provided against a chill that came from within, from the confrontation with possibilities that reduced human achievement to nothing, that made our great civilization seem ephemeral as morning dew. A sound from outside the warehouse made us all freeze. A scraping footstep, the careful movement of someone attempting stealth. Graves rose silently, moving to a small peephole in the wall, peering through it for several long moments before relaxing fractionally. A drunk, I think, using our courtyard for purposes better left unexamined. But we should not remain here much longer. The Order has resources, informants throughout the city, ways of finding what they seek. Holmes stopped his pacing, turning to face Graves directly. You still have not told us what happened to Edmund Blackwood. Does he live, or is he dead? Did his ritual succeed or fail? These are the questions we must answer, Mr. Graves, before we can determine what action, if any, to take next. Graves returned to his chair, suddenly looking older, more tired, the weight of his knowledge pressing down upon him like a physical thing. I do not know, he admitted, and the confession clearly cost him. Our organization monitors the sealed sites, maintains awareness of the ward's condition through methods both scientific and otherwise. 3 nights ago, we detected a disturbance at St. Olave's, a fluctuation in the energies we track, suggesting someone had entered the space, had attempted to interact with the seal itself. By the time our agents arrived, the church was empty, save for evidence of ritual activity, symbols drawn correctly, but executed with a hesitation of incomplete knowledge. Of Blackwood himself, we found no trace, no body, no blood, nothing but his abandoned coat and that figurine his sister recovered. Then he could still be alive, I interjected, clinging to this possibility, to the hope that our investigation might end with rescue rather than merely solving a disappearance. He could be hiding, afraid perhaps of what he unleashed, or attempting to reverse some error he made during the ritual. Perhaps, Graves agreed, though his tone suggested he believed otherwise. Or perhaps the ritual required a sacrifice, a payment in flesh and spirit, and Edmund Blackwood provided that payment, intentionally or otherwise. The old magics demand balance, Mr. Holmes. Every ceiling requires something sealed within it. Every ward needs an anchor, a consciousness to maintain its integrity. If Blackwood's ritual succeeded, it may have done so by consuming him, by binding his essence into the ward itself, making him part of the seal even as it strengthened it. The implications of this statement hung in the air like the fog outside, heavy and oppressive and impossible to ignore. Holmes stood perfectly motionless for what seemed an eternity, his silhouette sharp against the lamplight, his mind clearly racing through possibilities, constructing and discarding theories with the rapid efficiency that characterized his genius. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had rarely heard, a gravity that suggested he had arrived at conclusions that troubled even his rigorous rationality. "We must see the church," he said simply. "The the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. St. Olav's in Suffolk. Whatever happened there 3 nights ago left traces, evidence that your organisation may have overlooked or misinterpreted. I have made a career of seeing what others miss, Mr. Graves, and I suggest we apply that skill to this mystery before making assumptions about Edmund Blackwood's fate. Graves regarded him thoughtfully, fingers drumming against his empty glass in a rhythm that might have been nervousness or might have been calculation. Outside, the fog continued its patient siege, pressing against every surface, seeking entry into spaces meant for human habitation, transforming London into something primordial, something that belonged more to dreams than waking reality. "The church is dangerous," he said at last, his voice low and measured. "Not merely because the Order watches it, hoping Blackwood or someone connected to him will return, but because the space itself has been compromised. Whatever Edmund did or attempted, it altered the energies there, created instabilities that make even approaching the structure hazardous to those sensitive to such things." "Then it is fortunate," Holmes replied with a ghost of a smile, "that I am not particularly sensitive to such things. My talents lie in observation and deduction, Mr. Graves, in the physical evidence left by physical actions, regardless of how supernatural their intent may have been. I do not discount the existence of forces beyond current scientific understanding, but I maintain that all forces, however mysterious, operate according to consistent principles that can be observed, measured, and ultimately comprehended." I found myself nodding in agreement, drawing comfort from Holmes's rationality, even as my imagination conjured images of vast shapes coiled beneath London streets, of chambers echoing with the slow breath of sleeping enormity. The brandy had steadied my nerves, but could not entirely dispel the creeping unease that had taken residence in my chest, a tightness that made breathing feel like conscious effort rather than automatic function. Yet Holmes was right, as he so often proved to be. Mystery dissolved before methodical investigation, and cowering in this hidden room would accomplish nothing save allowing fear to calcify into permanent paralysis. Graves rose from his chair, moving to one of the wall-mounted maps, this one showing Southwark in remarkable detail, street names marked alongside annotations in a cramped hand that suggested years of accumulated observation. "St. Olav's stands here," he indicated with his finger, "on a street that dead ends at the river, isolated from the main thoroughfares by warehouses and derelict buildings. The church itself dates to the 11th century, though portions of the structure are older still, incorporated Roman stonework, suggesting this was a site of significance even in ancient times. It fell into disuse after the Reformation, changed hands numerous times, served briefly as a workhouse, then stood empty for decades. The Order attempted to purchase it several years ago, but our organisation blocked the sale through various intermediaries, understanding that allowing them direct control would be catastrophic." He traced a route on the map with his finger, following streets that wound through Southwark's maze-like geography. "We can approach from the river, using the old dock entrances, avoiding the main streets where the Order's watchers likely patrol. The fog will aid us, though I warn you both that St. Olav's vicinity may prove even more obscured than the rest of London. The disturbance Edmund created seems to have intensified the mist in that immediate area, as if something below responds to the weakening of its containment by reaching upward, testing the boundaries of its prison." We prepared to depart. Graves providing us with dark cloaks that would help us blend with shadows and fog. Substantial garments that smelled of wax and wool and something else. Some treatment that he claimed would offer protection. Of a sort I did not quite understand, but accepted regardless. He checked his revolver with practiced efficiency, then offered similar weapons to Holmes and myself, which we accepted, despite neither of us being enthusiastic about violence. Sometimes, however, prudence demanded preparedness, and the bird-masked figures from Blackwood's rooms had radiated a menace that suggested they would not hesitate if our paths crossed again. The journey to the river required navigating a series of back alleys and enclosed passages that formed a network beneath and between Clerkenwell's buildings. Routes that Graves explained had existed since medieval times, maintained by various organizations for purposes both legitimate and otherwise. We moved through darkness broken only by Graves's shrouded lantern, our footsteps echoing strangely in the confined spaces. Water dripping from unseen sources, creating a constant percussion that might have been soothing had circumstances been different. At one point, we passed through what appeared to be a section of Roman wall, ancient bricks still intact after nearly 2 millennia, speaking of engineering and ambition that had outlasted the empire that created it. We emerged eventually near the Thames, the great river reduced to a presence more felt than seen, its usual reek of sewage and commerce muted by the fog that sat upon its surface like a living blanket, moving with currents both liquid and atmospheric. Graves led us along the embankment, past tied-up barges that loomed suddenly from the greyness, their forms distorted and strange, past warehouses whose windows gazed blindly outward, seeing nothing, reflecting nothing, dead spaces in a dead landscape. The sound of water lapping against stone provided rhythm to our progress, ancient and eternal. The river caring nothing for human dramas playing out along its banks, flowing toward the sea with the same patience it had exhibited since before London existed, since before humans built their first crude settlements on these marshy shores. St. Olave's revealed itself gradually, a darker solidity emerging from the surrounding fog, its square tower rising toward an invisible sky, stone walls that had witnessed centuries flowing past like the river nearby. The building emanated abandonment, that particular quality of neglect that comes not from months, but from decades of disuse, of time accumulating without interruption by human presence or purpose. The windows gaped empty, their glass long since broken or removed, allowing fog to drift freely through the interior, erasing boundaries between outside and inside, between sacred space and common air. The door hung partially open, and it was immediately apparent that this was the forced entry Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned. The lock mechanism shattered, wood splintered, violence applied with determination and perhaps desperation. Holmes paused at the threshold, one hand raised to forestall our entry, his head tilted as he listened to something I could not hear, or perhaps felt something I could not sense. The fog around the church seemed different somehow, thicker and more active, swirling in patterns that suggested currents, movement, the presence of something disturbing it from below or within. A sound drifted from the interior, so low it registered more as vibration than audible noise. A rumbling that resonated in bone and chest cavity, that spoke of vast spaces and forces operating on scales beyond human comprehension. "Do you feel it?" Graves whispered, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching awe, or perhaps dread. "The seal weakens. Whatever Edmund did It created fractures in the containment, allowed the dreaming consciousness below to reach further upward than it has in living memory. The fog is not merely weather, gentlemen. It is manifestation, the visible expression of a sleeping mind's awareness, brushing against our waking world. Holmes remained motionless, absorbing this information, integrating it with his own observations, building his internal map of the situation with the same methodical care he applied to all mysteries. Then he stepped forward across the threshold, and immediately the temperature dropped, the cold striking with physical force, breath emerging as visible clouds, frost forming on stone surfaces with impossible speed. The church's interior opened before us, nave and transepts partially collapsed, rubble scattered across flagstones that had been laid when Norman kings ruled England, when the world was younger and perhaps stranger, more willing to acknowledge mysteries that later ages would deny. But it was the floor near the altar that commanded attention, where Edmund Blackwood had conducted his ritual. The symbols Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned were indeed present, drawn in what appeared to be chalk and ash, mixed with something darker, possibly blood, arranged in patterns that hurt to observe directly, that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally, suggesting dimensions or geometries that human eyes were not meant to perceive. At the center of this elaborate construction sat a circle, perhaps 10 feet in diameter, perfectly drawn despite the uneven floor. And at its heart lay the coat Mrs. Blackwood had described, spread flat as if its wearer had simply dissolved, leaving behind only fabric and memory. Holmes approached the circle carefully, stopping just outside its boundary, kneeling to examine the symbols more closely without touching them. His breath came in rapid clouds, but whether from cold or excitement or apprehension I could not determine. I moved to stand beside him, and Graves positioned himself near the door, keeping watch, his hand resting on the revolver in his coat, his attention divided between us and the fog-filled space beyond the church's broken walls. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, producing a small magnifying glass from his pocket, examining minute details invisible to my less trained eye. The execution shows both knowledge and uncertainty, as if Edmund worked from incomplete instructions, filling gaps with educated guesses. Here, this symbol, it should connect to this line, but the angle is wrong, the proportion off by several degrees. And here, this section appears to have been redrawn multiple times, the earlier attempts still visible beneath the final version. This was not the work of an expert practitioner, Watson, but of a dedicated amateur attempting to perform a task beyond his full understanding. A sound from above made us all look upward toward the tower, a flutter of wings perhaps, or the scrape of claws on stone. Something moving through spaces meant only for birds and wind. The rumbling vibration intensified briefly, then faded, leaving behind silence that felt expectant, watching as if the church itself held its breath, waiting for what would happen next, what revelation or disaster our presence might precipitate. Holmes's fingers hovered over the coat, not quite touching it, and in the uncertain light I thought I saw something else, a shimmer or distortion in the air above the fabric, a suggestion of form without substance, of presence without physical reality. "Edmund Blackwood," Holmes said quietly, speaking to the empty church, or perhaps to something that lingered there still. "If any portion of you remains aware, if the ritual bound you here rather than destroying you entirely, I need you to understand. that we seek only truth, only knowledge of what occurred. Your sister grieves for you. She deserves answers, whatever those answers may be. The fog within the church moved suddenly, swirling inward toward the circle as if drawn by invisible currents, and the temperature dropped further still, so cold now that frost formed on my eyelashes, that each breath burned in my lungs. The shimmer above the coat intensified, taking on suggestion of human form, translucent and unstable, a ghost or echo or memory, given temporary substance by forces I could not begin to name. The form that coalesced above Edmund Blackwood's abandoned coat possessed no clear edges, no definite boundaries where substance ended and empty air began, but rather existed as a concentration of fog and cold and something else entirely, something that might have been consciousness stripped of flesh, awareness without the anchor of physical form. It shifted and wavered like heat rising from summer pavement, like reflections in disturbed water, never quite resolving into recognizable human shape, yet suggesting it nonetheless, the way a child's scribble might suggest a face to eyes willing to see one. The temperature continued its impossible descent, so cold now that my fingers ached even within my gloves, that my lungs protested each inhalation with sharp pain, that frost crept across stone surfaces with visible speed, transforming the ancient church into something arctic, hostile to warm-blooded life. Holmes remained kneeling at the circle's edge, perfectly still, his grey eyes fixed upon the manifestation with an intensity that bordered on communion, as if, through sheer force of will, he might compel clarity from the obscure, substance from shadow. His breath emerged in rapid clouds that mingled with the general fog, becoming indistinguishable from the greater atmosphere, a small surrender of individual identity to the collective mystery surrounding us. Graves had moved closer, drawn despite obvious reluctance, his face pale in the dim light filtering through broken windows, his hand no longer resting on his weapon, but hanging uselessly at his side, confronted with something that bullets could not address, could not threaten or deter. The manifestation seemed to perceive Holmes specifically, or perhaps simply responded to his address, to the fact that someone had spoken directly to it, acknowledging its presence, inviting communication across whatever boundary separated its existence from ours. A sound emerged from it, or perhaps from the air surrounding it, a whisper that carried no single voice, but rather suggested multitudes speaking in terrible harmony, words overlapping and interweaving until meaning became nearly impossible to extract from the sonic tapestry. I strained to hear, to distinguish syllables from the general susurrus, and gradually certain phrases emerged with clarity, repeated often enough to pierce the confusion. The seal, incomplete knowledge. Too late to stop. The waking has begun. Holmes leaned closer, seemingly immune to the cold that had driven Graves and me back several steps. His voice steady when he spoke, though I could see his hands trembling, though frost had begun forming on his coat and hair, transforming him into something statuesque, glacial. "Edmund Blackwood, is that you? Can you tell us what happened here? Did your ritual succeed or fail? Where are you now?" The manifestation pulsed, brightening and dimming like a failing lamp, and the whisper intensified, becoming almost comprehensible, almost clear. "Not Edmund, not anymore. Bound to the seal, part of the ward, consciousness distributed, stretched across boundaries, can feel it below. The ancient hunger, the patient rage, it knows. It knows someone touched the seal. It reaches upward. Testing. A tremendous crash from somewhere beneath us shook the entire church. Dust and small stones raining down from the damaged ceiling. Cracks spreading across flagstones with sounds like rifle shots in the confined space. The rumbling that had been barely perceptible intensified into something undeniable. A vibration so profound it disrupted vision, made the world seem to stutter and jump. Reality itself becoming uncertain, unstable. Graves shouted something lost in the noise, his face transformed by fear so pure it erased personality, reduced him to animal instinct, screaming flight, escape, anywhere but here. But Holmes did not move, kept his position at the circle's edge as if magnetically held there, his voice raised now to be heard above the tumult. Is there a way to reinforce the seal, to complete what you began? Tell us what must be done. The manifestation expanded suddenly, doubling in size, the human suggestion within it becoming clearer for a brief moment, recognizable as male, middle-aged, scholarly, features marked by exhaustion and determination, and something like acceptance, like peace achieved through sacrifice. The whisper resolved into clarity, into words that carried weight and urgency, despite their ethereal origin. The ritual requires 3 elements Edmund lacked, it said, and now I could almost believe I heard individual personality in the voice, could almost convince myself that some fragment of the missing antiquarian remained sufficiently intact to communicate. The Dragon Codex pages scattered across London, the original sealstone from Roman foundations, and willing sacrifice, blood and consciousness freely given. Edmund provided the third, but lacked the first 2. The seal holds, but weakens, cracks spreading, dreams seeping through with greater force each day. Another crash, closer this time, and I thought I saw movement in the shadows at the church's eastern end, near where the floor had partially collapsed, revealing darkness beneath that seemed absolute, that no light could penetrate or illuminate. Something vast shifted in that darkness, or perhaps it was merely imagination responding to accumulated fear, but I could have sworn I saw a gleam like light reflecting from an enormous eye, from a scale the size of a dinner plate, from a claw that could rend stone as easily as I might tear paper. Holmes had finally stood, backing away from the circle with visible reluctance, his scientific curiosity warring with survival instinct, the eternal tension that defined his character playing out in real time across his features. Where can we find these elements? The codex pages, the seal stone. If there is a possibility of reinforcing the ward, of preventing whatever catastrophe you foresee, we must pursue it regardless of personal risk. The manifestation began to fade, its energy apparently exhausted, or its window of communication closing. The fog that comprised it dispersing back into the general atmosphere, returning to undifferentiated mist. But before it dissolved entirely, it spoke once more, the whisper faint now, receding like tide from shore. Graves knows. His organization guards. Seek the keeper of records. Beneath the temple. Hurry, it wakes faster now. Edmund's failed ritual accelerated rather than prevented. The dragon dreams of flight. Dreams of sky. Dreams of fire. Then nothing. Only empty fog and cold, and the persistent rumbling from below. Diminished slightly, but not vanished. A constant reminder of presence, of proximity, of something massive and ancient, stirring in depths humans had convinced themselves were safely distant, safely mythological. The coat remained where it had lain, but the shimmer was gone. The sense of lingering consciousness departed, leaving behind only fabric and the echoes of words that might have been hallucination, might have been collective delusion, born of fear and cold and atmospheric conditions that defied normal explanation. Graves had recovered some composure, though his hands still shook as he gestured urgently toward the door. "We must leave immediately. That vibration, that movement below, it suggests the entity has become more active than at any point in our recorded observations. If it continues to wake at this accelerated rate, if the seal's deterioration proceeds unchecked, we have days at most before something catastrophic occurs, something that will make the Great Fire look like a candle flame by comparison." We fled the church with undignified haste, stumbling over rubble, slipping on frost-slicked stones, emerging into the fog that seemed welcoming after the supernatural cold within St. Olave's. Almost warm by comparison, though it remained far colder than any natural London mist. The rumbling followed us, or perhaps it was simply so pervasive now that distance made no difference, that the entire city trembled with the slow rhythm of something enormous drawing breath, stretching limbs too long confined, testing the strength of its prison with increasing confidence. Back at the river, we paused to catch our breath, leaning against a warehouse wall, the Thames flowing past with indifferent consistency, caring nothing for our discoveries or fears. Holmes had regained his characteristic composure with remarkable speed, his mind already working on the problem, organizing information, planning next steps. "This keeper of records you mentioned, Mr. Graves, housed beneath the temple. I assume you refer to Temple Church, the round church built by the Knights Templar in the 12th century." Graves nodded, still breathing heavily, his earlier confidence shaken but not destroyed. "The church itself is merely the visible portion. Beneath it lie chambers and tunnels extending far deeper than any official record acknowledges, spaces the Templars excavated for purposes that remain unclear, though we suspect they too encountered evidence of what sleeps below, incorporated its management into their mysterious practices. Our organization inherited these spaces when the Templars fell, have maintained them ever since, using them to store documents and artifacts too dangerous for common access. The keeper is difficult to explain. Think of him as a librarian of the impossible, a guardian of knowledge that could destroy the unprepared mind." Holmes smiled despite the circumstances, that quick, fierce grin that appeared when he confronted challenges worthy of his abilities. "Then, it seems our next destination is clear. Watson, are you with me? I would understand if you chose to return to Baker Street, to relative safety and rational comfort. What lies ahead promises neither." I met his eyes and saw there not just the thrill of the hunt, but genuine concern, authentic worry for my welfare, the kind of care that true friendship provides even when left unspoken. "I have followed you into danger countless times, Holmes. I see no reason to break that pattern now, particularly when the stakes appear so impossibly high. Besides," I added, attempting levity that fell somewhat flat, "who will chronicle this adventure if I am not present to witness it? Future generations deserve to know how Sherlock Holmes saved London from a dragon." "Or failed spectacularly," Holmes replied, but his tone carried gratitude, acknowledgement of loyalty that meant more than any direct expression of thanks could convey. He turned to Graves. "Lead on, then, to Temple Church and your mysterious keeper. We have lost sufficient time already, And if Edmund's ghost spoke truly, every hour brings us closer to catastrophe that will make previous disasters seem like mild inconvenience. We set off through the fog, 3 figures moving through grey emptiness, the city reduced to sounds without visible sources, life continuing its patterns hidden behind the veil that had transformed London into something dreamlike, uncertain, balanced on the edge between the familiar world and something far stranger, far older, that had been sleeping below all along, patient beyond human comprehension, waiting for the moment when its restraints would weaken sufficiently to permit emergence, return, reclamation of dominion. It surrendered only under duress millennia ago, when the world changed and forced adaptation or extinction. The dragon was choosing emergence, choosing to test whether enough time had passed, whether this humanity's watch had grown lax enough to permit the impossible to become actual once more. Orchestrated narrative continuity and plotted atmospheric church scene. The form that coalesced above Edmund Blackwood's abandoned coat possessed no clear edges, no definite boundaries where substance ended and empty air began, but rather existed as a concentration of fog and cold, and something else entirely, something that might have been consciousness stripped of flesh, awareness without the anchor of physical form. It shifted and wavered like heat rising from summer pavement, like reflections in disturbed water, never quite resolving into recognizable human shape, yet suggesting it nonetheless, the way a child's scribble might suggest a face to eyes willing to see one. The temperature continued its impossible descent, so cold now that my fingers ached even within my gloves, that my lungs protested each inhalation with sharp pain, that frost crept across stone surfaces with visible speed, transforming the ancient church into something arctic, hostile to warm-blooded life. Holmes remained kneeling at the circle's edge, perfectly still, his grey eyes fixed upon the manifestation, with an intensity that bordered on communion, as if, through sheer force of will, he might compel clarity from the obscure, substance from shadow. His breath emerged in rapid clouds that mingled with the general fog, becoming indistinguishable from the greater atmosphere, a small surrender of individual identity to the collective mystery surrounding us. Graves had moved closer, drawn despite obvious reluctance, his face pale in the dim light filtering through broken windows, his hand no longer resting on his weapon, but hanging uselessly at his side, confronted with something that bullets could not address, could not threaten or deter. The manifestation seemed to perceive Holmes specifically, or perhaps simply responded to his address, to the fact that someone had spoken directly to it, acknowledging its presence, inviting communication across whatever boundary separated its existence from ours. A sound emerged from it, or perhaps from the air surrounding it, a whisper that carried no single voice, but rather suggested multitudes speaking in terrible harmony, words overlapping and interweaving until meaning became nearly impossible to extract from the sonic tapestry. I strained to hear, to distinguish syllables from the general susurrus, and gradually certain phrases emerged with clarity, repeated often enough to pierce the confusion. The seal, incomplete knowledge, too late to stop. The waking has begun. Holmes leaned closer, seemingly immune to the cold that had driven Graves and me back several steps, his voice steady when he spoke, though I could see his hands trembling, though frost had begun forming on his coat and hair, transforming him into something statuesque, glacial. "Edmund Blackwood, is that you?" Can you tell us what happened here? Did your ritual succeed or fail? Where are you now?" The manifestation pulsed, brightening and dimming like a failing lamp, and the whisper intensified, becoming almost comprehensible, almost clear. "Not Edmund. Not anymore. Bound to the seal, part of the ward. Consciousness distributed, stretched across boundaries. Can feel it below. The ancient hunger, the patient rage. It knows. It knows someone touched the seal. It reaches upward. Testing." A tremendous crash from somewhere beneath us shook the entire church. Dust and small stones raining down from the damaged ceiling. Cracks spreading across flagstones with sounds like rifle shots in the confined space. The rumbling that had been barely perceptible intensified into something undeniable. A vibration so profound it disrupted vision, made the world seem to stutter and jump. Reality itself becoming uncertain, unstable. Graves shouted something lost in the noise, his face transformed by fear so pure it erased personality, reduced him to animal instinct screaming flight, escape, anywhere but here. But Holmes did not move, kept his position at the circle's edge, as if magnetically held there, his voice raised now to be heard above the tumult. "Is there a way to reinforce the seal? To complete what you began? Tell us what must be done." The manifestation expanded suddenly, doubling in size, the human suggestion within it becoming clearer for a brief moment, recognizable as male, middle-aged, scholarly, features marked by exhaustion and determination, and something like acceptance, like peace achieved through sacrifice. The whisper resolved into clarity, into words that carried weight and urgency despite their ethereal origin. "The ritual requires 3 elements Edmund lacked," it said, and now I could almost believe I heard individual personality in the voice, could almost convince myself that some fragment of the missing antiquarian remained sufficiently intact to communicate. The Dragon Codex pages scattered across London, the original sealstone from Roman foundations, and willing sacrifice, blood and consciousness freely given. Edmund provided the third, but lacked the first 2. The seal holds, but weakens, cracks spreading, dreams seeping through with greater force each day. Another crash, closer this time, and I thought I saw movement in the shadows at the church's eastern end, near where the floor had partially collapsed, revealing darkness beneath that seemed absolute, that no light could penetrate or illuminate. Something vast shifted in that darkness, or perhaps it was merely imagination responding to accumulated fear. But I could have sworn I saw a gleam like light reflecting from an enormous eye, from a scale the size of a dinner plate, from a claw that could rend stone as easily as I might tear paper. Holmes had finally stood, backing away from the circle with visible reluctance, his scientific curiosity warring with survival instinct, the eternal tension that defined his character playing out in real time across his features. Where can we find these elements? The codex pages, the sealstone? If there is a possibility of reinforcing the ward, of preventing whatever catastrophe you foresee, we must pursue it regardless of personal risk. The manifestation began to fade, its energy apparently exhausted, or its window of communication closing. The fog that comprised it dispersing back into the general atmosphere, returning to undifferentiated mist. But before it dissolved entirely, it spoke once more, the whisper faint now, receding like tide from shore. Graves knows, his organization guards, seek the keeper of records, beneath the temple. Hurry, it wakes faster now. Edmund's failed ritual accelerated, rather than prevented, the dragon dreams of flight, dreams of sky, dreams of fire. Then nothing, only empty fog and cold, and the persistent rumbling from below, diminished slightly but not vanished, a constant reminder of presence, of proximity, of something massive and ancient, stirring in depths humans had convinced themselves were safely distant, safely mythological. The coat remained where it had lain, but the shimmer was gone. The sense of lingering consciousness departed, leaving behind only fabric and the echoes of words that might have been hallucination, might have been collective delusion, born of fear and cold and atmospheric conditions that defied normal explanation. Graves had recovered some composure, though his hands still shook as he gestured urgently toward the door. We must leave immediately. That vibration, that movement below, it suggests the entity has become more active than at any point in our recorded observations. If it continues to wake at this accelerated rate, if the seal's deterioration proceeds unchecked, we have days at most before something catastrophic occurs, something that will make the Great Fire look like a candle flame by comparison. We fled the church with undignified haste, stumbling over rubble, slipping on frost-slicked stones, emerging into the fog that seemed welcoming after the supernatural cold within St. Olave's. Almost warm by comparison, though it remained far colder than any natural London mist. The rumbling followed us, or perhaps it was simply so pervasive now that distance made no difference, that the entire city trembled with the slow rhythm of something enormous drawing breath, stretching limbs too long confined, testing the strength of its prison with increasing confidence. Back at the river, we paused to catch our breath, leaning against a warehouse wall, the Thames flowing past with indifferent consistency, caring nothing for our discoveries or fears. Holmes had regained his characteristic composure with remarkable speed, his mind already working on the problem, organizing information, planning next steps. This keeper of records you mentioned, Mr. Graves, housed beneath the temple. I assume you refer to Temple Church, the round church built by the Knights Templar in the 12th century. Graves nodded, still breathing heavily, his earlier confidence shaken, but not destroyed. The church itself is merely the visible portion. Beneath it lie chambers and tunnels extending far deeper than any official record acknowledges. Spaces the Templars excavated for purposes that remain unclear, though we suspect they too encountered evidence of what sleeps below, incorporated its management into their mysterious practices. Our organization inherited these spaces when the Templars fell, have maintained them ever since, using them to store documents and artifacts too dangerous for common access. The Keeper is difficult to explain. Think of him as a librarian of the impossible, a guardian of knowledge that could destroy the unprepared mind. Holmes smiled despite the circumstances, that quick, fierce grin that appeared when he confronted challenges worthy of his abilities. Then, it seems our next destination is clear. Watson, are you with me? I would understand if you chose to return to Baker Street, to relative safety and rational comfort. What lies ahead promises neither. I met his eyes, and saw there not just the thrill of the hunt, but genuine concern, authentic worry for my welfare, the kind of care that true friendship provides even when left unspoken. I have followed you into danger countless times, Holmes. I see no reason to break that pattern now, particularly when the stakes appear so impossibly high. Besides, I added, attempting levity that fell somewhat flat. Who will chronicle this adventure if I am not present to witness it? Future generations deserve to know how Sherlock Holmes saved London from a dragon. Or failed spectacularly, Holmes replied, but his tone carried gratitude, acknowledgement of loyalty that meant more than any direct expression of thanks could convey. He turned to Graves. Lead on, then, to Temple Church and your mysterious keeper. We have lost sufficient time already, and if Edmund's ghost spoke truly, every hour brings us closer to catastrophe that will make previous disasters seem like mild inconvenience. We set off through the fog, 3 figures moving through grey emptiness. The city reduced to sounds without visible sources. Life continuing its patterns hidden behind the veil that had transformed London into something dreamlike, uncertain, balanced on the edge between the familiar world and something far stranger, far older, that had been sleeping below all along, patient beyond human comprehension, waiting for the moment when its restraints would weaken sufficiently to permit emergence, return, reclamation of dominion. It surrendered only under duress millennia ago when the world changed and forced adaptation or extinction. The dragon was choosing emergence, choosing to test whether enough time had passed, whether humanity's watch had grown lax enough to permit the impossible to become actual once more. Orchestrated narrative continuity and plotted atmospheric church scene. The form that coalesced above Edmund Blackwood's abandoned coat possessed no clear edges, no definite boundaries where substance ended and empty air began, but rather existed as a concentration of fog and cold, and something else entirely, something that might have been consciousness stripped of flesh, awareness without the anchor of physical form. It shifted and wavered like heat rising from summer pavement, like reflections in disturbed water, never quite resolving into recognizable human shape, yet suggesting it nonetheless, the way a child's scribble might suggest a face to eyes willing to see one. The temperature continued its impossible descent, so cold now that my fingers ached even within my gloves, that my lungs protested each inhalation with sharp pain, that frost crept across stone surfaces with visible speed, transforming the ancient church into something arctic, hostile to warm-blooded life. Holmes remained kneeling at the circle's edge, perfectly still, his grey eyes fixed upon the manifestation, with an intensity that bordered on communion, as if, through sheer force of will, he might compel clarity from the obscure, substance from shadow. His breath emerged in rapid clouds that mingled with the general fog, becoming indistinguishable from the greater atmosphere, a small surrender of individual identity to the collective mystery surrounding us. Graves had moved closer, drawn despite obvious reluctance, his face pale in the dim light filtering through broken windows, his hand no longer resting on his weapon, but hanging uselessly at his side, confronted with something that bullets could not address, could not threaten or deter. The manifestation seemed to perceive Holmes specifically, or perhaps simply responded to his address, to the fact that someone had spoken directly to it, acknowledging its presence, inviting communication across whatever boundary separated its existence from ours. A sound emerged from it, or perhaps from the air surrounding it, a whisper that carried no single voice, but rather suggested multitudes speaking in the terrible harmony, words overlapping and interweaving until meaning became nearly impossible to extract from the sonic tapestry. I strained to hear, to distinguish syllables from the general susurrus, and gradually certain phrases emerged with clarity, repeated often enough to pierce the confusion. The seal. Incomplete knowledge. Too late to stop. The waking has begun. Holmes leaned closer, seemingly immune to the cold that had driven Graves and me back several steps. His voice steady when he spoke, though I could see his hands trembling, though frost had begun forming on his coat and hair, transforming him into something statuesque, glacial. "Edmund Blackwood, is that you? Can you tell us what happened here? Did your ritual succeed or fail? Where are you now?" The manifestation pulsed, brightening and dimming like a failing lamp, and the whisper intensified, becoming almost comprehensible, almost clear. Not Edmund, not anymore, bound to the seal, part of the ward, consciousness distributed, stretched across boundaries, can feel it below. The ancient hunger, the patient rage. It knows. It knows someone touched the seal. It reaches upward. Testing. A tremendous crash from somewhere beneath us shook the entire church. Dust and small stones raining down from the damaged ceiling. Cracks spreading across flagstones with sounds like rifle shots in the confined space. The rumbling that had been barely perceptible intensified into something undeniable. A vibration so profound it disrupted vision, made the world seem to stutter and jump. Reality itself becoming uncertain, unstable. Graves shouted something lost in the noise, his face transformed by fear, so pure it erased personality, reduced him to animal instinct, screaming flight, escape, anywhere but here. But Holmes did not move, kept his position at the circle's edge, as if magnetically held there. His voice raised now to be heard above the tumult. "Is there a way to reinforce the seal? To complete what you began? Tell us what must be done." The manifestation expanded suddenly, doubling in size, the human suggestion within it becoming clearer for a brief moment. Recognizable as male, middle-aged, scholarly, features marked by exhaustion and determination, and something like acceptance, like peace achieved through sacrifice. The whisper resolved into clarity, into words that carried weight and urgency, despite their ethereal origin. "The ritual requires 3 elements Edmund lacked," it said, and now I could almost believe I heard individual personality in the voice, could almost convince myself that some fragment of the missing antiquarian remained sufficiently intact to communicate. The Dragon Codex pages scattered across London, the original sealstone from Roman foundations, and willing sacrifice, blood and consciousness freely given. Edmund provided the third, but lacked the first 2. The seal holds, but weakens, cracks spreading, dreams seeping through with greater force each day. Another crash, closer this time, and I thought I saw movement in the shadows at the church's eastern end, near where the floor had partially collapsed, revealing darkness beneath that seemed absolute, that no light could penetrate or illuminate. Something vast shifted in that darkness, or perhaps it was merely imagination responding to accumulated fear. But I could have sworn I saw a gleam like light reflecting from an enormous eye, from a scale the size of a dinner plate, from a claw that could rend stone as easily as I might tear paper. Holmes had finally stood, backing away from the circle with visible reluctance, his scientific curiosity warring with survival instinct, the eternal tension that defined his character playing out in real time across his features. Where can we find these elements? The codex pages, the seal stone, if there is a possibility of reinforcing the ward, of preventing whatever catastrophe you foresee. We must pursue it regardless of personal risk. The manifestation began to fade, its energy apparently exhausted, or its window of communication closing. The fog that comprised it dispersing back into the general atmosphere, returning to undifferentiated mist. But before it dissolved entirely, it spoke once more, the whisper faint now, receding like tide from shore. Graves knows. His organization guards. Seek the keeper of records. Beneath the temple. Hurry, it wakes faster now. Edmund's failed ritual accelerated rather than prevented. The dragon dreams of flight. Dreams of sky. Dreams of fire. Then nothing. Only empty fog and cold, and the persistent rumbling from below. Diminished slightly, but not vanished. A constant reminder of presence, of proximity, of something massive and ancient, stirring in depths humans had convinced themselves were safely distant, safely mythological. The coat remained where it had lain, but the shimmer was gone. The sense of lingering consciousness departed, leaving behind only fabric and the echoes of words that might have been hallucination, might have been collective delusion, born of fear and cold and atmospheric conditions that defied normal explanation. Graves had recovered some composure, though his hands still shook as he gestured urgently toward the door. We must leave immediately. That vibration, that movement below, it suggests the entity has become more active than at any point in our recorded observations. If it continues to wake at this accelerated rate, if the seal's deterioration proceeds unchecked, we have days at most before something catastrophic occurs, something that will make the Great Fire look like a candle flame by comparison. We fled the church with undignified haste, stumbling over rubble, slipping on frost-slicked stones, emerging into the fog that seemed welcoming after the supernatural cold within St. Olave's. Almost warm by comparison, though it remained far colder than any natural London mist. The rumbling followed us, or perhaps it was simply so pervasive now that distance made no difference, that the entire city trembled with the slow rhythm of something enormous drawing breath, stretching limbs too long confined, testing the strength of its prison with increasing confidence. Back at the river, we paused to catch our breath, leaning against a warehouse wall, the Thames flowing past with indifferent consistency, caring nothing for our discoveries or fears. Holmes had regained his characteristic composure with remarkable speed, his mind already working on the problem, organizing information, planning next steps. This keeper of records you mentioned, Mr. Graves, housed beneath the temple. I assume you refer to Temple Church, the round church built by the Knights Templar in the 12th century. Graves nodded, still breathing heavily, his earlier confidence shaken but not destroyed. The church itself is merely the visible portion. Beneath it lie chambers and tunnels extending far deeper than any official record acknowledges, spaces the Templars excavated for purposes that remain unclear, though we suspect they too encountered evidence of what sleeps below, incorporated its management into their mysterious practices. Our organization inherited these spaces when the Templars fell, have maintained them ever since, using them to store documents and artifacts too dangerous for common access. The keeper is difficult to explain. Think of him as a librarian of the impossible, a guardian of knowledge that could destroy the unprepared mind. Holmes smiled despite the circumstances, that quick, fierce grin that appeared when he confronted challenges worthy of his abilities. Then, it seems our next destination is clear. Watson, are you with me? I would understand if you chose to return to Baker Street, to relative safety and rational comfort. What lies ahead promises neither. I met his eyes and saw there not just the thrill of the hunt, but genuine concern, authentic worry for my welfare, the kind of care that true friendship provides even when left unspoken. I have followed you into danger countless times, Holmes. I see no reason to break that pattern now, particularly when the stakes appear so impossibly high. Besides, I added, attempting levity that fell somewhat flat, who will chronicle this adventure if I am not present to witness it? Future generations deserve to know how Sherlock Holmes saved London from a dragon. Or failed spectacularly, Holmes replied, but his tone carried gratitude, acknowledgement of loyalty, that meant more than any direct expression of thanks could convey. He turned to Graves. Lead on, then, to Temple Church and your mysterious keeper. We have lost sufficient time already, and if Edmund's ghost spoke truly, every hour brings us closer to catastrophe that will make previous disasters seem like mild inconvenience. We set off through the fog, 3 figures moving through grey emptiness, the city reduced to sounds without visible sources, life continuing its patterns hidden behind the veil that had transformed London into something dreamlike, uncertain, balanced on the edge between the familiar world and something far stranger, far older, that had been sleeping below all along, patient beyond human comprehension, waiting for the moment when its restraints would weaken sufficiently to permit emergence, return, reclamation of dominion. It surrendered only under duress millennia ago, when the world changed and forced adaptation or extinction. The dragon was choosing emergence, choosing to test whether enough time had passed, whether this humanity's watch had grown lax enough to permit the impossible to become actual once more.